Hello. I wanted to compare Pokemon to the other biggest trading card game, Magic, also known as Magic the Gathering or MTG. And here I think it'll be useful to apply a framework that Jake often brings up, which is the difference in mindset between a flipper versus a collector versus an investor. And I want to talk primarily about investing, but in order to do so, I think it'll first be helpful to start with the mindset of a collector. And so in my opinion, Magic is pretty different from Pokemon because collecting is mostly about the playability of the cards. As far as we know, in Pokemon, most people are buying the cards in order to put them into a collection, because they enjoy the cards, looking at them, completing sets, and so forth. In Magic, that certainly happens, but it's much, much, much more prominent that people play the game. In fact, I don't think I've ever met anyone who only collects and doesn't play the game. And so while amassing a collection in Pokemon is more of a hobby that's about going after the things that you want to possess or own, in order to look at or trade or whatever you want to do with them, in Magic, it's primarily about amassing collections so you can build decks. And of course, there are many different permutations of this. People like to build casual decks to play with their friends, or Commander, which is a more casual format, more competitive decks. But the people who are buying cards in Magic, as far as we know, primarily is people who are playing the game. And so what that means is the value of Magic cards is so tied to their playability. In order to be a good investor in Magic, you have to understand the game really well, and not just the game, but the metagame and all the different formats, meaning sets of cards that people are allowed to play with in different versions of the Magic game. So in Pokemon, that's certainly important for more modern cards, right? The value of a ton of cards that are more recent, like Crobat V is a good example. It's tied up in the playability of the card, and once it rotates out of the format, meaning once it's been 2 years and it's no longer legal and standard, I'm sure its value will drop. But that's not true for the vast majority of Pokemon cards. Again, the vast majority of people who buy cards, as far as we know. And so for Magic, in the long term, investing is still about the playability of the cards because there are plenty of formats that aren't just extremely recent, right? In addition to standard, there's modern, there's historic, online, there's pioneer, more recent format, legacy, and so forth. And so almost every card, with the exception of a very small number, is playable in some format. And the most valuable cards in Magic are still tied to their playability, right? Like everyone knows Black Lotus is the most valuable Magic card. Of course, it's because it's very old and rare and scarce, but it's also because it's an extremely powerful card and arguably the most powerful card in the game. Now, of course, you can't play it in most formats, but if you did want to play Vintage, right, if you want to be a high roller and buy extremely expensive cards to play these old formats, Black Lotus is basically, the best card. And so Magic has something called the Reserve List you might have heard of. It's basically a list of cards that the company Wizards of the Coast has promised never to reprint again. As far as we know, there's nothing similar to that in Pokemon. So Magic, cards that are on the Reserve List are way more valuable than cards that are not, because they're not in danger of being reprinted in a newer set. But even the cards on the Reserve List that are more valuable than the other Reserve List cards, it's because they're playable in those older formats. So I think that if you want to try to figure out which cards are going to be playable in the long term in Magic, right, in various formats, which cards are going to become staple in Modern or Legacy if that doesn't die, you have to know the game extremely well, but also just get pretty lucky and make predictions, right, about what will get reprinted. And as we've seen in recent years, pretty much everything that's not in the Reserve List is in danger, or for some people, in the benefit of being reprinted and becoming a lot cheaper. And so for me personally, I don't presume to be able to make any of those guesses, even though I keep up with the game. And part of the reason that I put some money into Magic is because I love keeping up with the game and reading about all the newest cards and watching people play in tournaments. And very rarely I have time to play myself, but I'm keeping up with it anyway. So I put sort of a little bit of money into sets in a sort of version of like you call an index fund, which in my mind is sealed booster boxes. So I've invested in sealed booster boxes in Magic and run a bit of an experiment to see, can my investing in sealed product beat the most basic form of investing I think there is, which is just putting money into the S&P 500, the total stock market, or an index fund of the total stock market. And so what I'm going to share now, let's see, here we go, are the Magic booster boxes that I bought over time. And so you can see I keep meticulous track of everything. I've got the set name, when the original set was released, but then when I purchased the box and where I got it and how much I bought it for, and then how much it's worth right now. And you'll see not everything here is a booster box, right? Like I bought some of these special sets called From the Vault, which are reprint, of a few cards. I bought a complete set, I think, of Fate Reforged, because I was playing a lot online at the time. I had almost a complete set from just drafting online anyway, that I paid some, this price to redeem it and get the physical cards. But for the most part, these are booster boxes. I bought some more recently also that I didn't include on the spreadsheet because it was very recent, so I'm not tracking how much they've appreciated so far. So I take the current price, I subtract 3% for PayPal, 10% for eBay fees, and then $10 average shipping for each booster box. And this is sort of how much I could have in value right now. So you look at that difference, you say, oh, pretty good. I've made a profit, $566. If I average the annualized growth for each of these, using its when I actually bought it as a starting point, the average annualized growth would be about 9.2%, which is pretty good and pretty close to what people consider the average stock market to be, but not beating it by a long shot. So I actually wanted to dive deeper into that calculation and see if I had bought the S&P on the date that I bought the booster box, which is over here, how much was S&P worth, how many shares of it I've gotten, assuming you can get fractional shares, for whatever I spent on the booster box, including the cost of tax and shipping and all that. And so I would have ended up at the end of all this with 0.55 shares. Today, they would be worth this much. This is, I think, the close of the stock market last weekend. And so that's how much I would have. So here I made another big assumption, which is essentially that I would pay taxes on selling shares of the S&P 500 and not selling shares of Magic. So obviously you're obligated by law to pay taxes on any capital gains that you make. But for me, I spend more, unfortunately, than I make on hobbies and trading cards. So I've just rolled that into it. So that's a big assumption. But if you make that assumption, you assume you're paying 15% capital gains tax on S&P 500 shares. This is what I would end up with, which is how much less? About $100 less than I ended up with for Magic. So in my mind, that's actually pretty bad, right? Like all the time it took to buy those cards and sort of research, right, the sets that I wanted to invest in. And then I haven't even done this yet, but the time it would take to sell all these boxes on eBay, list them and take pictures and send them and, all that stuff, of course, is not worth the $100 gain in my mind that I've had if I would just invested in the S&P 500. But as with everything investing, you can't predict the future, couldn't have known it at the time. Looking back on this, I think I made a lot of mistakes. The biggest mistake I made was that I was very quick to pull the trigger. This was, I started buying these boxes right when I was getting back into Magic. So this was about 6 years ago, after sort of having abandoned it since high school days. And so I was so excited about it, I was learning about all the new cards and sort of catching up on years and years and years of history in the game, that I just bought sets that I sort of wanted to own, that I thought would be really cool to own. And so some of these ended up being great choices, and I certainly would have made them again if I'd done more research, right? After doing a lot of research, I knew Innistrad was a really good set. You can read people saying online it's one of the top sets of all time to draft, which means you want to have the box so you can open new packs and draft it. I think Concept Tarkir obviously is a great bet because of the fetch lands. Fate of Forge, I have the full set, which doesn't have fetch lands, but has some other cards like Ugin. Some of the terrible picks I made were, Born of the Gods. Like at the time, these sets, Theros and Born of the Gods, had recently come out a year or two ago, and I thought they were just so cool. Like Magic sets based on Greek myths, like, everyone's going to want that in the future. Of course, Born of the Gods is basically a terrible set. I got lucky in that Theros appreciated recently because there's some cards from it that are valuable, but for the most part, I was quick to pull the trigger on these things. I was very excited to own instead of taking more time to research them. And if I'd even spent a few more months researching instead of buying it December of 2014, I bought them a few months later, I think I would have made much better bets and hopefully would have come out even more ahead of the S&P 500 if you look at it today. On the other hand, for me, a big part of this is obviously about having fun. And so the way that I see it is these are the boxes I set aside for investing. I bought other Magic cards, of course, to build decks and, pre-constructed decks that I like to play. Those are just for fun. But if any of these boxes didn't appreciate in value, I'd say just take it out of my investing pool. I'm no longer counting it as investment. I'll just open it, right? I'll open it with friends and draft a box together. And so of course some boxes are better draft than others, but I think with any of these I've had a ton of fun. So part of my investing strategy, if you call it that, was which sets have very playable cards that I think are at high likelihood of becoming format staples and low likelihood of being reprinted often and so forth. But the other part of it was just which of these sets do I find very appealing, either to play or to look at, and which of these sets would I be happy just to crack the box and enjoy. So that's how I approached it. Now, the very last thing I want to talk about was investing not for the long term, Magic, it's been 6 years since I started, but for the very, very long term, right? We talked on the channel about the risk, like what if Pokemon dies? Similar risk, what if Magic dies? I think that risk is very low, and even if they did die, like other people have said, there would still be plenty of years of catch up, right? Even like this generation that was around, if Pokemon died, would still be growing up and still interested in the cards, 20, 30, 40 years later. But an interesting analog of a game that has died that I'm very into, I've mentioned on the channel before, is a Star Wars CCG. It was made by Decipher. It first came out in 1995, so just 2 years after Magic, 1 or 2 years before Pokemon. Just in case you've seen these cards before, this is Darth Vader, sort of the most exciting card from the first set. Millennium Falcon, another one from the first set. I'll show some more of these cards in a minute, but I love them. I grew up with this game, and these cards were extremely hard to get, and now of course you can get them for relatively cheaper given inflation than you could have in the past. So what's interesting about this game is that it did die in 2001. Star Wars hasn't died. Obviously, Star Wars is still going strong, but the company Decipher lost their license to make the game. There's a really, really interesting article about the history of all this. I'll post it in the comments. I think it's absolutely worth reading as an analog, right, to some other trading card games. What's really interesting is that there's a committee of players that keeps the game going. So they're not allowed to make new cards because Disney owns the license, you know, so Lucasfilm owns the license to Star Wars. They don't have it anymore, but they print these virtual versions of cards you can print out and put on top of the cards. So the game is still going. Obviously, they have way, way fewer players than they've had in the past, but people still play the game, what is this, 19 years after it died. And so I'd say there's a pretty even, maybe 2/3 to 1/3 split between people who collect just for the sake of collecting, like me, because I've never even learned the rules how to play. It's like even more complicated than Magic. I'd love to learn someday, but I haven't yet, versus people who collect. And so from an investing perspective, I'm not sure if this is the best bet because yes, the game died 20 years ago and it's still going strong, but it's probably going strong for the reason that people like me who grew up with the game when we were young are the ones who are still playing it today and sort of keeping it alive. And maybe when our generation, you know, dies out or retires, to be less morbid, it won't have any value. But for me personally, you know, going back into that framework, I'm not doing any of this as an investment for Star Wars. I just love it. I love collecting the cards. There's that rush that you get to like, here are all the cards I couldn't get as a kid. And so my other favorite ones, Son of Skywalker version of Luke, the original Boba Fett, Daughter of Skywalker, another version of Leia. None of these cards I just showed are, you know, the most valuable in the game. The ones that came out a lot later, when the printing was more scarce and fewer people into the game, are more rare. And I have a lot of those too, but I just love it. And I kind of, you know, as Jake says, I wouldn't be sad if the value of all this went to zero because then I would just buy more cards because I love putting them in binders and, you know, completing sets and looking at them so much. And so to me, I see Magic as very different from Star Wars, right? Star Wars is about collecting. Magic, I play it too, but on the collecting side, it's more about making these investments and trying to bet on the future. And so I'm not worried about Magic dying, or if it died, I'm not worried about the value going down because people would still play it for years. For Star Wars, I am kind of worried that, you know, it could die, but I wouldn't be sad if the value of the cards went down. So I'd love to know what you think about this, really. Like if you have thoughts on comparing Pokemon to Magic, other card games, if you've ever heard of Star Wars CCG, definitely let me know because I'm low-key obsessed. But other games too, where we can draw some comparisons and think about the difference in collecting, flipping, investing, and also investing in the short term versus long term versus like the long term of, you know, what's gonna be valuable in our retirement. Thank you.